this actually is a wonderful opportunity for me to look inside some of my own views about the concept of the sacred and about how important it is for us in the modern world to retrieve it. And I want to talk really from the philosophical point of view, taking into account the fact that we do live in a largely secular society, perhaps less so here in America than in Europe, but nevertheless it still is largely secular. And yet, perhaps partly because of that, we feel all around us a growing need for the sacred, not just as an object, but also as a way of life. And I want to explore why that is so and how we as modern people might use this idea to bring people a little bit back towards the tradition in which we were all brought up. Now, what do I do with this? There we are. I've gone too far, haven't I? Right. We all accept the scientific worldview. That's to say, we believe that the universe has a kind of order to it which can be explored and discovered by people who have no religious faith. And this universe was put before us by Newton with his clockwork idea of how everything functions according to rigorous laws of motion. And that for a long time in the 17th and 18th century was accepted as the truth about the universe, but people also believed that the universe was created, that the clock had been set in motion by the divinity, and that it went on forever in time and forever in space. We just happened to occupy some small part of it. But nevertheless, God was there as the entity on which it all depended. At a certain point, Kant, the German philosopher, raised this great question, the question, where is the edge of the world? If you think that it has a beginning in time, then what was it about that beginning that made it possible that the universe should exist just then? There could be no answer to that question unless you refer to some prior moment. So it couldn't have a beginning in time. But of course it must have a beginning in time, otherwise an infinite series of moments would have elapsed. And how can an infinite series come to an end? So it must have a beginning, and it can't have a beginning. So if we think about the universe in this way, as a totality, we end up in contradictions. That's what Kant thought. Now, I won't say his arguments were necessarily valid, but he put before people the thought that maybe we're not in a position, we human beings, to understand the universe as a whole. We can only understand it from our point of view, and our understanding can reach out to the edge of the universe, but not beyond that edge. It's as though we lived surrounded by a one-sided boundary, confined in space and time, but not able to get to beyond the beginning in time or the end in time, or likewise get beyond the edge of space. We're contained within an envelope. And then the question arises, although we can't get beyond that boundary, is there nevertheless something beyond that boundary? In our time, quantum mechanics has obviously made a great difference to people's way of looking at the world, because quantum mechanics seems to imply that how things are in the universe at the smallest level is something which is affected by our own attempts to measure it. In which case, is there really such a distinction as we think there is between the universe and our point of view upon it? Are we even more firmly trapped in our point of view by modern science than even Kant thought we were? So all of this has led to the question of what our place in the cosmos is. And you, as I'm sure most of the people in this room will think, well, that question is not really a scientific question. Whatever science tells us, we know that we're in relation to something else. It's just that we cannot have a complete account of what that something else is, except through faith. Now, recently, as we know, we've been subjected to a barrage of propaganda on behalf of the evolutionary theory of our nature, which tells us that actually not only are we a small part of the universe, but we are simply the product of a process of adaptation which we share with all the other animals and with the plants, according to which we have come to be adapted to our environment and therefore to possess the capacities needed to understand that environment as something that is useful for our own reproduction. That in the end, all we are is machines for the reproduction of our genes. And whatever we think about our point of view on the world, that's all that its validity amounts to. It's the thing that gives us the means to reproduce. And what room is there for God in such a picture? So now that's just a brief summary of something which you're all aware of course. And the question is that all there is that we can say? Kant introduced a concept of transcendental idealism, partly in order to answer this question. He said that we can understand the limits of our knowledge, and this is something very important. We can actually think up to those limits, and he gave lots of arguments for showing us what those limits are. And that is something wonderful about us, that we can transcend our point of view insofar as to see just how limited it is, but we can't get beyond those limits. Yet, as he also said, we have kind of intimations of things beyond the limits, intimations of the transcendental. In the moral life, for example, we know with absolute certainty and necessity that we are free. We know that we are bound by laws of reason, the law that we must treat each other in such a way as to obey a law that all of us could accept. We must will the maximum of our action as a law for all rational beings, as he put it. This idea that we're subjected to a categorical imperative which binds us regardless of any empirical circumstances, that is something that we know a priori. We don't know how it is that we know it, but it brings with it an intimation of a world beyond the one on which our eyes, as it were, are opened. Likewise, in aesthetic experience, in the experience of art and the beauty of nature especially, we seem to be granted intimations of a world beyond, of a transcendental realm about which we can't actually speak, but nevertheless, of which we can have a certain kind of knowledge. Wittgenstein famously said at the end of his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus that whereof we cannot speak, we must consign to silence. But the very sentence contains within it the thought that there is something whereof we cannot speak. But of course, he's also telling us to shut up about it. But a true artist is somebody who doesn't want to shut up about it. As I say, doesn't want to rabbit on with words, but to do something else which provides an intimation of what that thing is that lies beyond the reach of the ordinary understanding. So this doesn't mean that we have no knowledge of transcendental things, only that it is not a factual knowledge. And this brings me to the idea about which I have been asked to talk, which is the idea of the sacred. At a certain point at the end of the turn of the 19th century, 19th and 20th century, the anthropologists who had done all that work in Africa and South America and so on, exploring the visions of more primitive people, came up with the view that indeed all observed human beings seem to have a conception of the sacred. And the famous sociologist Emil Durkheim, who was the son of a rabbi, in fact, and brought up in the Jewish faith, became obsessed with this question. He asked himself the question, why is it that all human beings, regardless of their experience and where they've come from and what their surrounding circumstances are, regardless of that, they have a sense of the sacred? As he described it, they have a sense that certain things are set aside and forbidden, like the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, the thing that cannot be touched without some transcendental authority for doing so. And these things are surrounded by rituals in which our bodies, so to speak, are taken over by the collective need for reverence. And of course, this wonderful Mass that we have just been to is a perfect illustration of this conception of the sacred, but embellished in a very interesting way, embodying 1,000 years of tradition. Now, people give evolutionary explanations of this. They say that, this forbidding of things, this holding things apart, is a way of reinforcing our sense of community. If we're all, as it were, subservient to this act of reverence, if we all join in the ritual and recognize the untouchability of the object, that holds us together in a way that we would never be held together by a mere contract or a mere agreement to be with each other. And this has a role, again, in reproduction. Purity and taboo, these concepts that anthropologists have also been so interested by, they also have this kind of role in reproduction. By believing that certain things should not be touched, by striving to be pure, people are, according to the evolutionists, they are saving their gene pool. They're saving their genetic inheritance and guaranteeing that it will be passed on. And this way, people are trying to develop a kind of natural science of the sacred, saying that this is just like any other experience. It's there because it promotes the reproduction of the human gene, and that's all there is to it. But this natural science of the sacred, I maintain, will never actually satisfy us. Just as we would never be satisfied by a natural science of mathematics or music. Suppose someone said that the reason why human beings are all mathematical, why we understand these extraordinary truths, such as that 2 + 2 = 4, is that if we didn't, then we would never reproduce. If you can't add, you won't multiply. But we know that might be true as a scientific explanation, but it doesn't tell us what mathematics means or what it's about. And the same is true of music as well, and the same is true of the sacred. It's not an instinctual thing. It belongs to our way of thinking about each other, to our reasoning and our self-knowledge. And there grows around it a whole system of storytelling and beliefs which gain confirmation in our experience. We know that our sense of the sacred is directed towards the world in some way. It's directed towards that one-sided boundary which we cannot cross by ordinary thinking, but we do seem to be able to cross in moments of inspiration and elevation of the kind that art puts before us. So no such science of the sacred would ever satisfy us.